As I'm reading through the book, The Master and His Emissary, which is a book by Iain Mcgilchrist that explores the differences between the right and the left hemisphere of the brain in functionality, let's say, I've been really questioning this idea that limits or constraints are actually limiting, paradoxically enough. And I think the more you look into the book, the more you actually realize this fact. So the book goes on to outline the fact that the right hemisphere is usually more contextual, it's usually more aware of its own limitations, it usually tries to take reality in its whole context, let's say. And as we said, it's usually more aware of its own limitations, as opposed to the left hemisphere, which is usually more, you could say, analytical from one sense. It's also more fragmentary. It decontextualizes things from their holistic context, let's say. So it's usually dealing more so with abstractions, let's say, rather than experiences, the left hemisphere, that is. So those two systems, or you could say conflicting systems within the same skull or within the same brain, are actually constantly warring with each other. And war is not necessarily the right word, but I mean, the brain is obviously very much integrated in a very complex way, so it's not necessarily a battle, but there's definitely something that is conflicting between those two hemispheres that is always taking place, in a sense. And you can think of the left hemisphere as a limitation to the right hemisphere, because the right hemisphere is trying to see, as we said, the holistic context, but then the left hemisphere is trying to decontextualize things to understand them even more, or abstract them away, paradoxically enough, to understand them even more. But that constant warring between those two hemispheres is actually what gives rise to consciousness as complex as it is, even though we would think at the first instance that the left hemisphere is just trying to limit the right hemisphere. But that counterposition of both of those systems is actually very useful, as we said, again, paradoxically enough. So I think we could take this idea and kind of extrapolate it to many different domains. And we could apply it to the moral domain, we could also apply it to the political domain, or whatever, any other domain, let's say. And I think the general insight we can extract from this is that limitations in and of themselves are not a constraint, let's say, or are not something that pushes back boundless progress. There is a certain level of limitations or constraints that is needed in order for boundless progress to happen. And I think the question that pops to mind when we want something to be boundlessly progressive to a certain extent, we want to progress something boundlessly, we think, how do we actually remove the limitations or the constraints from it in order for it to progress to the degree that that's possible? But I think after exploring the brain and seeing how the limitations are actually the thing that gives rise to its complex and very, let's say, creative structure, as soon as we see that model, we kind of think, not necessarily how do we remove the constraints or the limitations, we think, what are the right limitations to put in place in order for that system to flourish to the degree that that's possible? And I think this is almost like a revolutionary idea. So instead of trying to remove, let's say, friction from certain kinds of motion, we start to ask, what is the optimal amount of friction in order to allow or facilitate for that motion to happen? And I think once you start to think about it deeply, you see it everywhere. You see this pattern of something that is going in one position, but then there is an optimal limitation that is there in order for that system to flourish to the degree that that's possible. Even though we might think that there isn't a limitation, but there usually is a limitation that kind of makes it flourish, as we said, to the degree that that's possible. So another example that comes to mind is how uniqueness in and of itself requires imitation. So in order for someone to be unique, let's say, there is a certain kind of imitation that needs to be there in order for that uniqueness to be boundless. And you can think of the imitation as a constraint to the uniqueness, let's say, because you're kind of copying other people. But there is an optimal, let's say, amount of imitation and, let's say, uniqueness that needs to go in counterposition to one another in order for someone to be very creative. So if you don't think that this is true at the first instance, just try to think of secluding someone from their childhood, let's say, and not making them meet people. Would that person be more unique than other people? Well, not necessarily. They wouldn't be able to even express their uniqueness because they don't have that optimal, let's say, counterposition of both of those systems. So in a sense, leaving someone, let's say, on their own completely, even though that might sound that they would be more unique, but they wouldn't even have the tools to express their uniqueness. So it seems like there is some kind of imitation that needs to be there in order for someone to be maximally creative, let's say, or maximally unique to a certain extent. And it seems like a paradoxical idea at the first instance, but you could also think of it in relationship to language. So language is imitation in and of itself. So the tool of language, which is, as we said, imitation, requires to be there in order for something creative to happen. So I think as soon as we think of it in that paradigm, it starts to make even more sense. And we could take this general scheme, as we said, and really apply it to any idea we could possibly think of. So now the new question that emerges is that how much of a limit do we actually need for something to flourish to the degree that that's possible, rather than just removing the constraint or limit altogether, let's say. And I think it's a really interesting framework to think about things from that perspective, let's say.